The procession moved along a rutted road beneath the canopy of tall trees that lined the slopes, scattered with farms. At the front walked the newlyweds, followed by their relatives, then the guests, and finally the local poor. Boys darted about like flies, slipping into the ranks, climbing trees to get a better view of the spectacle. Jean Patou, the groom, was a handsome fellow and the wealthiest farmer in the region. But above all, he was known as a passionate hunter. He would abandon all prudence for the sake of his obsession, spending lavishly on dogs, guards, ferrets, and rifles. Rosalie Roussel, the bride, had drawn the attention of every eligible bachelor in the area, thanks to both her looks and her dowry. She chose Patou, perhaps because she liked him more than the others, but more likely, true to the practical spirit of a Norman woman, because he had the most money. When the procession rounded the tall fence of the groom's farm, 40 gunshots rang out. The shooters were nowhere to be seen. They had hidden in the ditches. The thunderous noise sent the men into a frenzy of joy. They began to stomp and dance in their festive clothes. Patou, leaving his bride behind, dashed toward a servant he spotted behind a tree, snatched a rifle from him, and fired it himself, frolicking like a colt. The procession resumed its march, passing apple trees heavy with fruit, through unmown grass, among calves who stared wide-eyed, slowly rising to their feet and stretching their muzzles toward the passing crowd. As they neared the house where the feast awaited, the men grew more solemn. The wealthier ones wore shiny silk-top hats that looked oddly out of place in the rustic setting. Others sported old wide-brimmed hats with long nap, as if made from mole pelts. The poorest wore simple caps. All the women had shawls draped over their shoulders, ceremoniously holding the ends in their hands. These shawls, bright, red, and fiery, shone so vividly that they seemed to astonish the black hens on the manure heaps, the ducks in the puddles, and the pigeons on the thatched roofs. The village greenery, grass and trees alike, seemed determined not to be outdone by this blazing crimson, and as the two colors met, they grew even more dazzling under the midday sun. Where the arch of apple branches ended, a large farmhouse stood as if waiting. Steam poured from its open windows and doors, and the rich aroma of food drifted from every crack, even from the very walls. The line of guests wound through the yard like a snake. Those at the front, reaching the porch, broke formation and dispersed, while through the wide-open gates more and more people continued to arrive. The ditches were now filled with boys and curious paupers. Gunshots echoed from all directions, leaving behind clouds of gunpowder smoke and a scent as intoxicating as absinthe. At the entrance, women brushed dust from their dresses, untied the bright ribbons of their hats, removed their shawls, draped them over their arms, and entered the house to shed the last of their adornments. The table was set in a spacious kitchen, large enough to hold 100 guests. Dinner began at 2 in the afternoon. By 8 in the evening, they were still eating. The men in unbuttoned vests and without coats, their faces flushed, devoured the dishes like bottomless barrels. Yellow, transparent, golden cider sparkled merrily in large glasses beside the blood-dark wine. Between courses, as was the Norman custom, they paused for a shot of vodka, which sent fire through their veins and folly to their heads. From time to time, a guest, stuffed to the brim, would step outside under the nearest tree, relieve himself, and return to the table with renewed appetite. The farm wives, crimson-faced and barely breathing, their bodices swollen like bubbles and cinched tight with corsets, were too modest to leave the table. though they were pressed from both above and below. But one, unable to bear any longer, stood up, and the rest followed. They returned in high spirits, ready to laugh again. That's when the heavy-handed jokes began. Across the table flew volleys of bawdy remarks, all about the wedding night. The full arsenal of peasant wit was unleashed. For 100 years, the same crude jokes had served such occasions, and despite their age, they still provoked bursts of laughter. One silver-haired old man declared, "To Mezzadin, all aboard the carriage," and the room erupted in laughter. At the far end of the table, for neighborly lads were brewing jokes for the newlyweds. Evidently, they had come up with something particularly clever. They stomped their feet, whispered conspiratorially, and exchanged excited glances. One of them, seizing a moment of silence, suddenly shouted, "Poachers will have a fine time tonight, especially with a moon like that. You're not planning to admire the moon, are you, Jean?" Jean spun around sharply. "Let them just try to show up." The lad burst out laughing. "Why wouldn't they come? You're not likely to abandon your business for their sake." The whole table shook with laughter. The floor trembled, glasses clinked. Jean flared with rage. The very thought that someone might use his wedding night to poach on his land drove him mad. "I'm telling you, let them dare." Then came a flood of suggestive jokes, making the bride blush slightly, trembling with anticipation and excitement. At last, after several barrels of vodka had been emptied, the guests retired for the night. The newlyweds went to their room, as was customary on farms, on the ground floor. The room was stuffy, so they opened the window and drew the shutters. A small, tasteless lamp, her father's gift, burned on the dresser. The bed stood ready to receive the new couple, who had no intention of dressing their first embrace in bourgeois ceremony. The young woman had already removed her headpiece and dress, now stood in her underskirt, taking off her shoes, while Jean finished his cigar, casting sidelong glances at her. He watched her with a glossy gaze, more lustful than tender. He didn't so much love her as he desired her. Suddenly, with a sharp motion, he stripped off his clothes, as if preparing for work. She untied her boots and began removing her stockings. Speaking to him familiarly, as to a childhood friend, she said, "Hide behind the curtain for a minute until I get into bed." He pretended to resist, then approached with a sly smile and slipped behind the curtain, poking his head out. She laughed, tried to blindfold him, and they played like that, cheerfully, intimately, without false modesty. To end the game, he gave in. She quickly loosened her final skirt, which slid down her legs and settled in a flat circle on the floor. She left it there, stepped over it, and dove in a bed in her fluttering nightshirt. The springs squealed under her weight. He came over, barefoot now, in just his trousers, and leaned toward her, seeking her lips, which she buried in the pillow. But at that moment, a gunshot rang out in the distance. Jean thought it came from the direction of the rape woods. He straightened, alarmed, heart pounding, rushed to the window, and flung open the shutter. The full moon bathed the yard in golden light. The shadows of apple trees lay in dark patches at the base of their trunks, and beyond, the fields of ripe grain shimmered. Just as Jean leaned out, listening to the night's sounds, two bare arms wrapped around his neck. His wife, pulling him back into the room, whispered, "Forget it. What does it matter? Come." He turned, seized her, embraced her, feeling her body through the thin fabric of her shirt, and lifted her in his strong arms, carrying her to their bed. The moment he laid her down, the mattress sagging beneath her, another shot rang out, closer this time. Jean jumped up, trembling with fury. "Damn it! They think I'll stay inside because of you. Just wait. He hurriedly put on his shoes, grabbed the rifle that always hung within reach. His frightened wife clung to his knees, begging him to stay, but he broke free, ran to the window, and leapt into the yard. She waited an hour, then another, until dawn. Her husband did not return. Distraught, she called for help and told them how Jean had flown into a rage and chased after the poachers. Immediately, the servants, drivers, and farmhands set off to search for their master. They found him 2 leagues from the farm, tied hand and foot, half dead from rage, his rifle broken, his trousers turned inside out, 3 dead hairs strung around his neck, and a note pinned to his chest. He who goes hunting forfeits his place. Later, when recounting his wedding night, he would add with a bitter grin, "Well, what can I say? It was quite the joke. Those scoundrels caught me in snares like a rabbit and pulled a sack over my head. But mark my words, if I ever get my hands on them." That's how they celebrate weddings in Normandy. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share your thoughts and impressions in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.